not necessarily going to share all new stuff today. I want to recap a lot of what we've been talking about for the last couple of months. And next week, Johan Meyring will close off the session on sonship, and we'll be going into spiritual fatherhood the month after that. So I'm going to be recapping, but I want you to see very clearly today the difference between living as an orphan and living as a son. There is a massive difference in our mindset, in our worldview, in how we do things and why we do things, in the understanding of being sons or in the understanding of being just orphans. I want to put it this way. Being an orphan is not just a mindset, it's a culture that we live in. It's a culture of orphan. And I want to speak today of living in the culture of sonship, because it is a massively different world to living in the culture and mindset as if it's normal of orphans. So the orphan culture we spoke about the last couple of weeks is characterized, and I want you to get this in your spirit, you must know this clearly off the top of your head. The orphan culture is characterized by what? Driven by the need for your provision and your protection. Have you got that in your spirit after all these months? Please, please, don't let this just be information. Get it into your spirit. Open up your spirit. Our orphan culture is driven by these things. I need to provide for myself, my own provision, and my own protection. Because Adam was separated from his father. Okay. And when Adam's soulish eyes were opened, and he started seeing with soulish eyes instead of seeing as he should with his spiritual eyes, immediately he became aware of his own vulnerability. And when he became aware of his vulnerability, immediately he put into action a way of trying to meet those needs. And he tried to address his vulnerability, providing for himself, clothing himself, because that's the culture of an orphan. And I want to say to you very clearly, you must understand this and get it in your spirit. The culture of an orphan does not come from heaven. It is something that happened here on earth as a result of the fall. It's an earthly mindset. It's an earthly culture that does not come from heaven, does not come from God. And it's so important that we need to see how important it is for us to move back to a culture of sonship. There's something we have to do consciously to move out of that culture of orphan. If we don't even know there's a need to move out of that culture, the way of living as orphans, and to live in a culture of sonship, then really, the zombies. We need to understand, what is the purpose that God placed us here on earth? Do you know why God placed us here on earth? Now, some would say God placed us here on earth to rule. Is that correct? Yes. But why did God place us here on earth to rule? And the context of understanding why we are here to rule and how we are to rule, we call that the dominion mandate. Have you heard of that? The dominion mandate. God put that in, he said, have dominion over the earth and over the fishes and the birds and the seas. Rule. Now, our understanding of that dominion mandate is different in the context of an orphan to what it is in understanding that dominion mandate in the context of a son. I'm going to say that again. The context in which we understand the dominion mandate is essential. So yes, we've been placed on the earth to rule. Why? Why rule? How to rule? The context in which we understand that. If we understand that as an orphan, it's a totally different context than if we understand that as a son. And so, in saying that God placed us here on earth to rule, even though it's true, might only be a half-truth, depending on your context. If you're living in a culture of an orphan and you're clinging to that statement that we place here to rule, it's only a half-truth. Because what will an orphan do? Not living in a son culture, living in an orphan culture, he will use all the opportunities he has to meet those needs of his own provision and his own protection. So, if an orphan comes into authority, if an orphan comes into power, if an orphan has the opportunity, he will use that authority, he will use that power, he will use that opportunity to shape all things to meet his needs of provision and protection. Do you understand that? Open your spirits, open your spirits. See this. There's a context of a culture of orphans that even though they know the truth, they're not living in the truth because their context is of orphans, and they'll use even the truth to abuse for the sake of meeting their own needs. And they'll abuse the dominion mandate to get their own needs and their own provision. And you know what the world does? The world protests. The world says there is no such thing as a dominion mandate. It can't be true that God created us to rule this earth. Why? Why does the world protest? Why does the world say that can't be true? Because what the world sees is Christians living in an orphan culture. And the world does not understand that we as Christians have lost the culture of sonship. And what the world's seeing is greedy orphans that results in the loss of the other set of orphans that those greedy orphans are ruling over or are governing. And we've seen that in presidents in Africa that proclaimed themselves to be a Christian president, Christian government, Christian parliament, Christian this. And what do? They live as orphans and they abuse everything they bend to meet their orphan need of provision and protection. I want to show you a few pictures. Can I show you a few pictures? See if you recognize these kids. Do you know that? Do you know that person? Okay, maybe you know this one. Don't know him? Okay, maybe this one looks more familiar. If you don't know these three people, they have a lot in common. You probably will recognize this fourth one better. Okay. These four children, and there's many of them, like I'm just using, just as a broad brush illustration. These four children all have something in common. In the natural, all had abusive fathers or no fathers. They were either orphaned or they were abused by abusive, harsh fathers. And what resulted in the natural, they had an orphan mentality. And I'm using this as an illustration in the natural to show you what happens even in the political realm. But let me say that even if you have a natural father that is good and you grow up in an orphan mentality spiritually, the same thing results spiritually because you still have that mindset. But these kids grew up to be people that we recognize. Let's look at that little baby. Grew up to be Hitler. Abusive father, and his father died when he was still young, a teenager. His mother died shortly after that. grew up in an orphan mentality. The other guy is Stalin, also abusive father, grew up in an orphan mentality. And I'm going to go a bit closer to home, and if you want to get offended, just get offended. That third person we saw is a Robert Mugabe. Similar situation, orphan. Grew up as an orphan. And lives in an orphan mentality. Uses all the power, authority, and opportunity he has to take as much as you can for your own provision of mine and my sort and my type, because. And he's got a disciple, that was the other young man we saw, Malema. In the natural, orphaned. In the spiritually, orphan. Operates in an orphan spirit. And I'm not making political statements. This has got nothing to do with politics. This has got to do with the reality of what we're dealing with in the world today, when people that call themselves Christians live in an orphan culture. We saw what happened in the genocide of Rwanda. It was Christians who were killing Christians. But orphans killing orphans. They didn't understand a sonship culture. And what happens when you live as an orphan in an orphan culture? You take what you can, when you can. I'm talking, if you think of African politics, or if you're thinking of chieftainship, as soon as there's opportunity of authority and power, you take what you can, when you can. Because you don't know how long you'll have the power. And your orphan mentality says, as soon as I don't have the power anymore, someone else is going to take it from me. So I better take as much as I can. And so you have a Mugabe that raves against England and against Tony Blair and whatever else, because they have stuff that I don't have. Meantime, he will run to England and spend millions for his own protection and his own provision. And he will never be satisfied. Why? Because he's an orphan. And he's living in orphan culture. And even if he calls himself a Christian, and if he says, because of Christians, we won't allow homosexuality and we won't do this, that is all just theology. In reality, he's living as an orphan. And that will produce orphan fruit of abuse, of manipulation. And I want you let's just look through this comparison of someone living as an orphan spirit or someone living in a sonship culture. And I'm just going to go through. We could spend a whole month or two just looking at this. I promise you. But I'm just going to go through just so that you can start getting an idea of what this looks like in reality. And you'll start identifying, hopefully, with it in your own life and in the things you've seen around you. But someone who lives in an orphan culture operates out of insecurity and jealousy. Whereas someone who lives in a sonship culture operates out of love and acceptance. Different results, different world they're living in. Maybe have the same theology. Do you understand? They may have the same theology, but they're living in a different context. Someone who lives in an orphan culture is jealous at the success of his brother. Where someone who's living in a sonship culture is committed to the success of his brother. Someone who lives in an orphan culture serves God to try and earn the Father's favor. Trying to perform, trying to do something that deserves God's favor and God's merit. Orphan mentality. Orphan culture, where someone that lives in a sonship culture serves God out of a sense of divine acceptance by God and out of a sense of, I have my Father's favor and I serve freely in that liberty. Someone who lives in an orphan culture tries to medicate their deep internal alienation from their father through physical stimulation. I'm not just talking about sexual, I'm talking about all physical, because an orphan sees himself as what? Flesh. And everything he's driven about is providing the needs of his flesh. And he tries to stimulate that which is fleshly because deep down he is alienated from his father. Whereas a son, living in a sonship culture, walks, absolutely just enjoys the joy of his father's presence and the comfort of a father. Do you see the difference? Because he sees himself as spirit, and he's living as a spirit being in the presence of his Father, who is spirit, and he's drinking from that. He's living out of that. That's life, that's bread, that's food for him. So often, in orphan culture, even if you have the right theology, you're driven by the need to succeed. You measure everything in terms of the temporal. And what is seen, what I can touch. The senses. And how I succeed in life, in the physical. Whereas someone that's living in a sonship culture is led by the Spirit of God. We spoke about that. I'm recapping on some of these things. I'm just recapping so that you can see it again from another angle. And go back. And they're led by the Spirit of God into their calling. They Spirit-led into that mission that the Father has for them. They led, effortless ease. They led into their destiny because an orphan is trying to survive and trying to make a living, where a son that knows he has inheritance is free to live out his destiny and his calling and his purpose, because he knows he has provision. He knows he has the foundation. He knows he has the basis from which to live that out. He doesn't still have to say, I'm worried about how I'm going to be able to survive. Okay, let's move on. Someone who lives in an orphan culture will use people to fulfill their goals. Where someone who's serving as a son in a son culture serves people to bless the kingdom. Now, let me tell you this next one, and we're going to talk about this next one next month when we start going into spiritual fathers. Someone who lives as an orphan in an orphan culture, you can't help it, but you repel your own natural children as you do spiritual children. Why? Because they are so caught up in abuse and trying to use their power and their authority and the opportunity to manipulate situations to get as much as I can out of the situation, to use people, even my own children or even the spiritual children, the congregation members, whatever, to try and build a name for myself, to try and establish myself as a mighty man of God or the big ministry. All these abuses happen, and people, instead of being spiritual fathers, are repelling, even though those spiritual children feel captive, like they are slaves caught in fear. But in their hearts, they're repelled by a spirit of an orphan. Instead of him being a spiritual father, he's not reproducing spiritual children. He's reproducing orphans. And that'll happen to you as a natural father. It'll happen to you as a spiritual father. We're going to be talking in depth about the importance of us being spiritual fathers, raising up spiritual children. Where those who live in sonship attract children. They attract spiritual children. They're attractive to their own children because they're serving them as an understanding of a mandate. They are also God's children. They're also sons of God. And to be a healthy father, you first have to have been a healthy son. If you have not enjoyed sonship, you don't know how to be a father, because you have to first have seen yourself as a son to be able to see your son as a son. And if you're not healthy in your relationship as a son, you'll become an abusive father. But those who live in a culture of sonship can serve their children and attract them to God's purposes and into spiritual sonship. So you can see that, how as an orphan you'll have anger and fits of rage. Where as a son you're resting in the Father's ability to control and guide your future. You see, there's two massive worlds of difference. The one's always in competition, the other one's able to bless. The one lacks self-esteem, the other one walks in love and acceptance of the Father. And so we could go on, like I say, we could spend months on that, just looking at the comparisons. I just want you to get in your spirit. Thanks, you can take that off. I just want you to get in your spirit the very reality of you can have the right theology. You can have the right theology. You can have the truth of God's word. But if your context is that of an orphan and not living in a culture of a son, you can't step up to sonship and you can't live in the truth of that reality. And you become the puppet of the enemy to sow destruction, chaos, and abuse in the world. Even though you have the truth, you don't have the truth of sonship, and your context is all out of whack. And so you'll see the environmentalists say about those that say, we have a mandate to rule. The environmentalists will say, no, you can't. And so what they will do is they will say, they will equate survival of the planet with survival of humanity. And so they say, no, we're all equal. Humans and animals and plants and everything on the planet, we're all equal. And so we deny the sovereignty mandate. We deny the sovereignty of God. Why do environmentalists say this? Because what they've seen the church do, and so they can't understand how this thing can work. Because they've seen one set of orphans applying the truth in an orphan culture. And so the one set of orphans say it's about my survival now. The environmentalists are just another set of orphans that see a longer term of survival. We survive because the planet survives, but it's still about our survival. Do you see? It's still two orphans debating about what is true. And this debate will never be sorted out if the sons of God don't step onto the scene and bring the perspective. I don't know if you're seeing that. I don't know if you're getting that in your spirit. The role we have. The debates go on in the world, but when the debates are between orphans, they will have no way to sort out. The issue will remain unresolved until there's a sonship understanding. And to return to a sonship culture, we must have the understanding, I'm saying it again, we must have the understanding that humans are spirits. I'm coming back to the question. So why are we here on earth? What is our purpose on earth? And you must understand, the purpose of spirit is very different to the purposes of flesh. That's what I'm saying. It's essential that we return to the understanding of humans as spirits. Because your understanding of your purpose as flesh is very different to your understanding of your purpose on earth as a spirit being. Now, let's look at Hebrews 1 verse 3. We've spoken about this in the previous months, and I'm going to just touch on it again. And in fact, I want us on Wednesday in our discovery groups to maybe soak in on this passage of Scripture. It's talking about Jesus, who is the Son of God. The Son is the radiance of God's glory and the exact representation of His, actual capital H, of God's being. Sustaining all things by His powerful word, after He provided purification for sins, He sat down on the right hand of the Father in the majesty of heaven. Okay. So, this describes the original culture of sonship. What is the culture of sonship? I want you to talk about this afterwards when we leave today. Ask each other, what is the culture of sonship? The culture of sonship is a son radiates his father's glory and is the exact representation of his being. Before the fall, Adam ruled on earth. And he ruled in the same characteristics, with the same character of his father as God. God walked with him in the cool of day, and Adam received the nature and the character of his father through fellowship, through communion, through intimacy. We spoke about that, and I'm reiterating it. You get it by drinking from your father in fellowship, in communion, and his characteristics become your characteristics. His nature becomes your nature. And so what Adam did, ruling in the nature and the character of his father, actually, he named the animals. Do you know that? And in naming the animals, he brought kingdom order onto earth. And in fact, even today, because he was ruling at that time in the nature and character of his father, bringing kingdom order to earth, we speak of today the animal kingdom and the plant kingdom, because Adam named them and sorted them out in kingdom order. And what was to happen as families were to be born on the earth and societies were to be formed, this kingdom order should be extended into civil order. Do you see that? So there should be God's kingdom order through Adam ruling under the characteristics of his father in the animal kingdom. There should be God's kingdom order in the plant kingdom. There should be God's kingdom order in society, civil order. As Adam communed with God, God was imparting to him his spirit. And so Adam, as a son of God, had the same view of creation as the Creator had. Do you see this? Because he was given understanding of the world by the one who created the world. And he was drinking from his father, ruling in the nature and the characteristics of his father, in intimacy with his father, understanding the world as the one who created the world made it to be understood. Because Adam was created to rule. And you and I were created to rule in a culture of sonship. And without rule, don't think rule is of the devil. Rule is God's provision, because without rule, there would be chaos. There would be abuse. There would be disorder. Ruling is God's idea. But what is ruling? Ruling is within a culture of sonship, within the character and the nature of the Father who created the earth, to be ruled within his order. Because when orphans rule, they do so with brutality. They do so with abuse. Why? Because they focused on self, their survival, their provision, their protection. So God didn't create the world and leave the world to unskilled orphans. That was not God's purpose, to leave the world to unskilled orphans. But he met with Adam, walking with him in the cool of the day, and imparted his spirit. There's another whole series we can do that we don't have time to do it today, but let me look at one scripture with you, the Spirit of God. And some would refer to Isaiah 11 verse 2 as referring to the 7 spirits of God. But God was imparting his spirit to God. Just look what God was imparting to Adam. What God imparts to his sons when we commune to him. His spirit. This is the spirits of God, the 7 spirits of God. The Spirit of God, first of all, is the spirit of lordship. The Spirit of the Lord. The spirit of lordship. Then we see a spirit of wisdom. You see that? We see a spirit of understanding. We see a spirit of counsel. We see a spirit of power. We see a spirit of knowledge. And we see a spirit of the fear of God. 7 spirits. Spirit of the lordship, which we've spoken quite a bit about. The spirit of wisdom, the spirit of understanding, the spirit of counsel, the spirit of power, the spirit of knowledge, the spirit of fear of God. And it's not the fear of God in being scared of God, it's being accountable to God. which comes from having a healthy love and respect for God and the higher order that God is and that He represents, and accountable to that higher order. So what you are, the culture you live in, either as an orphan or as a son, will produce what you are. If you're living in a culture that's caught up with your own provision and your own protection, you'll produce that type of abuse. But if you're living in the culture of sonship, the goodness and the mercy of your Father, which comes out of ultimate respect for God, it will produce that culture, will produce that order, will produce that standard in the earth, even into civil society. And that's how justice comes into society. That's how peace comes into society. Not by some political person that is an orphan saying, I'm a Christian and I'm going to apply the Bible. But by sons of God living in a culture of sonship, manifesting the order, the standard of heaven onto earth, where we have been placed to rule as sons. And so we understand that we've been placed to rule here, radiating the Father's glory, to be the radiance of the Father's glory. Now, Charlotte didn't know my notes. She never saw them. But what she was saying here was spirit. I can see immediately when Charlotte's in her own understanding and when she's in the spirit. And 95% of what she was saying she switched over into the spirit, and you could see exactly that's what God is saying. That's what God is saying. And He's talking about radiating His glory. What He's doing in us is purifying us as gold, taking us through processes. That was the Spirit of God saying He's preparing us to be sons in the earth that radiate the Father's glory. And a radiator, you know what a radiator is? Heat radiates out from the source. Who's the source? Our Father. And we are the radiation. We radiate the Father's glory. We multiply, radiate outwards the Father's glory by being the exact representation of His being, of who He is. And that's how we honor God, by ruling as viceroys. We've been speaking that from the beginning of the year, but I want you to see how this all fits together. We've been called to rule as viceroys. That's how we honor God. To exactly represent who He is on earth as His sons. Represent the standard of heaven, the culture of heaven, the order of heaven. That heaven's order, heaven's standard is reflected through us being sons here on earth, even into civil order. As it was in the animal kingdom and the plant kingdom, that will be in all of the order of earth. That in what we are as the sons of God, radiating His glory, the earth will see a display of the nature of our Father through us. For those of us whose spirits are coming alive, that are refusing to be zombies, walking around just as flesh packages, coming alive to say, I'm a spirit. This stuff should be igniting a fire within your spirit to say, so that's why I'm here. That's why I'm created. To radiate my Father's glory. And He's made all provision for me to do that. I can either see that truth as an orphan and still live in the abuse and in the trying to make it on my own, or I can step into the culture of a son that God intended me to operate in and radiate His glory. So then when I speak, it's not me speaking, but God speaking through me. When others see the generosity and the kindness of my Father, I'm radiating the nature and character of the God who creates the world with an environment that's compatible for all human needs. And the environmentalists don't have to say, well, this can't be because we're seeing the abuse. But they see the goodness, the kindness, the nature of the Father revealed through the sons who are ruling justly. And in the character of the Father, they'll see, but this good Father has made provision in the earth for all the needs of humanity because He's a good Father. We radiate that. I want to remind you of something we spoke about. We did a whole teaching on it. Go and get the tape on radiating the Father's glory and on the glory of the Son. Remember we spoke about that? Let me just remind you. John 17. I'm just going to show you two scriptures real quickly. Ons is amper klaar, maar dit is so lekker. Ons wil nie klaar kry nie. Here. I tell you, if you just come alive, if your spirit just comes alive, you'll be buzzing. You will be buzzing. You'll say, genoeg van die zombie lewe. I will not be living as a flesh, in the flesh, for the flesh, as an orphan culture. I'm stepping into a sonship culture. My goodness, that's what I'm created for. That's why it placed me on. Now I know not only why, I also know how. I know how to radiate the Father's glory because Jesus says to his Father, glorify me now in your presence with the glory I had before the world began. And later on in verse 22, he talks of a different glory. He says, I have given them the glory that you gave me. So there's two glories. Remember, we did the whole teaching on this, and if you don't, go and get this, go and get the recording. There's two glories. There's a glory Jesus had with the Father before he came to earth, when he was with the Father creating the earth. You see that? He had that glory. He gave up that glory to become a son. And he took on the glory of a son. I'm going to say that again. You need to see this. There's two glories. There's a glory Jesus had, being one with God, one with the Father, creating the universe with the Father. He had that glory. He gave up that glory and took on the glory of a son. A son comes to earth to demonstrate his Father's will, to demonstrate his Father's purpose. And he says, I do nothing except which is my Father's will. That is the glory of the Son. To manifest in here the presence of my Father that I radiate as a son. And I'm carrying that glory as a son. But then, at the end of his earthly ministry, Jesus is now saying, okay, my time here is up. Father, restore to me now the glory I had with you, being one with you, as God created the universe. I'm now taking that glory of the Son that you've given me, I'm now giving it to the sons. And we get to live in the glory of sonship. And if you go and read that passage, it's not, he says, to all those who will believe. I'm praying for all of those who will believe that they will receive this glory of sonship. And the glory of the Son is God. Can you fathom this? Can you fathom this? The creator of the universe. And just do yourself a favor and go and look at what the universe looks like. Go and look at the Hubble telescope and see some of the galaxies, millions of galaxies and millions of planets in the millions of galaxies. Mense, we are nothing in creation. But God of this creation, the God of the universe, chooses to live, confine himself in these earth clay pots. That, my brother, my sister, that is a glory that has been bestowed on us that we cannot comprehend. And it's not because of anything we could ever do to deserve it. It is because of the glory of sonship that God had made a covenant with himself to perform and make us the sons of God. And he brings his very presence in us. And so now it's not you doing for God anymore. I'm doing for God. How tough is that? This little speck of dust on this one little tiny planet in this tiny galaxy, in this massive galaxies of the Earth's creation, think we can do for God. Please, man, get a clue. It's not us doing for God. It is now. The glory of sonship is God doing through us. Do you think you can do the ministry of reconciliation? Do you think he's given us the ministry of reconciliation? Do you think you can reconcile man to God? No. It is God radiating His glory through us, in the glory of sonship. And He now, when we radiate the goodness of God, we allow God to radiate through us His goodness, His mercy. The goodness of God radiating through us draws men to repentance, and they reconcile to God. Kyk mense, how can we just sing songs as if it doesn't mean anything? Goodness, the songs we sing is not to make you feel lekker. It's to get your spirit connected with what's really going on here. Step up from the dead earthly culture of orphans. Step into the culture of sonship. Say, God, this is why I'm created. This is why I'm created. Not me. Trying to do it, trying to please God, trying to get His favor, trying to impress Him, but me radiating. Because He chose. He chose to give me the glory of sonship. He chose in His mighty, majestic power to come confine Himself in this body. Flesh can't even contain it. Don't try and live in the flesh as flesh. You're going to blow your flesh away. Because we are spirit beings. And when we come alive as spirit beings, walking around this planet that God placed us on as the sons of God, spirit beings, dangerous. Not because of what we do, we've got no strength of our own, but because God Himself is living in us, radiating. We are the extension of the household of God. It's a lekker dinkie. And outside of this, of course, religion is dead. Religion is the enemy's way to keep you sidetracked by thinking you're doing something important, when you're still just a zombie, disconnected from the reality of why you even created. So religion, do your religious stuff. Try and keep the enemy, trying to please God, all the lies, living in orphan culture. And the enemy lag hom klaar vir jou. Everyone can go to church as zombies, disconnected from being spirit beings. And the enemy kry vir jou, hy lag hom. Miljoene lag hy hom, because the only ones that are dangerous, are the ones that are spirit beings, woken up, living in the reality of a culture of sonship. And he cannot touch you. Cannot touch you. And now, for you to live or to die is in the will of God. You're totally not in the flesh. It's not a saak for you if I'm living, if I'm dying. How much I get, how much I don't get, who honors me, who doesn't honor me. You cloud that. Because you see who you are, you're living as a spirit. And now if I live, it's gain. If I die, it's gain. Maki saki, because I understand who I am. Okay, time is up. But I tell you what, I haven't done this for a while, but let me tell you, if you're sitting here today, you might have had religion, you might have had doctrine, you might have had theology, might have get that all right, you might have even have said a recital and the Lord's Prayer and the sinner's prayer and whatever else. And you know, as sure as God made little green apples, that you are sitting there as an orphan. And you're not connected as a son. You're not living as a son. You, my friend, have not been born again. You might have the theology. You might have alles reg. You might have said the right recipes, the right recitations, the right sinner's prayer. You might have gone through all the motions, jumped all through the hoops. If you're living as an orphan, and you don't know that you're a spirit living as a son of God with God in you radiating His glory, you have not yet been born again. And today is your opportunity.